And so what's really interesting to me is to see that even as we look at the miracles and the things that happened in Kings, when you read through the Gospels, often you see similar miracles, right? Stories about people eating and the food not running out, about people being healed, about lepers being touched and cleansed and healed. And it was neat for me to just be reminded again this past week as I read through 2 Kings again, is that this is the same God, Jesus, the same God in that time in the Old Testament. It's the same Jesus as the Jesus that we read about in the Gospels and the Jesus that we know currently, right? And the work that he was doing in these people's lives, he's the same God today doing that work in our lives. And so that was really cool for me to just be reminded of. And we even see, another way that I thought about that was, we see that in Luke chapter 4, verse 27, Jesus talks about Naaman, this guy that we're just reading about here. And Jesus says, in the time of Elijah, there were lots of lepers in Israel, but the only leper that was healed during the time of Elijah was Naaman the Syrian. And so, here Jesus is many years later talking about this story. And I'm just reminded, he's talking about it because he was there and he was a part of what was happening by his Holy Spirit. So this morning we want to look at this chapter, 2 Kings chapter 5, and it's focused around this man Naaman. And Naaman was a great man. He was from Syria, and he was a commander of the king of Syria's army. So he would have been a guy who was well known. He would have been elite. Some of the things I read said, he would have been up there as being like the second in command under the king. And so he would have been a great man. And it says here that he was a great man. And in fact, it says that as God disciplined the Israelites because they were not obeying him, God allowed the natural consequences of the sin of the Israelites to be that he would let Naaman's army conquer them. And so the Bible even talks about that in chapter 5 here of 2 Kings, that God was using the Syrians to discipline the Israelites because of the sin of the Israelites. And so Naaman would have been a very important man. He would have been very well known. He's the kind of guy where he would have had wealth and money and fame. And he had great victories in wars that he led. And there would have been parades in his name. And after victories, they would have had parades through the cities with him up on his chariot. And people would have cheered and applauded and known him. And he was very successful, very competent at his job. And 2 Kings talks about that. But then after it talks about his greatness, it says, but Naaman was a leper. So this great man who was leading this army and was very successful and competent also struggled with this disease, and he had this skin disease that was eating away at his life and would eventually kill him. And as I read some commentaries and studied this, it said that leprosy, when it's talked about here, leprosy could be a number of different skin diseases. And so whether it was common knowledge that he had leprosy or whether or not everyone was aware that he had it yet, it was a disease that he was battling with and struggling with. And he knew that eventually it was going to continue to grow in his body and spread. And eventually it would take his life, because that's what leprosy did. And so he was concerned. And being a commander of an army and a general and conquering other nations, when they raided Israel, one time he brought back, as they raided, they would bring back slaves that they had captured. And one of the slaves was this young girl that worked in his household. So I can imagine that as they brought back all these slaves and then they began to disperse the slaves or sell them or whatever they would do, Naaman's wife probably said, you know what, Naaman, this is a lot of work in my house, doing all the dishes and sweeping the floors and looking after things. That young girl right there, let's take her home. Let's take her and she will be our servant, and she can do the dishes and sweep the floors and look after the house and help me with that type of stuff. And so there's this young Israelite girl living in the house of Naaman. And so this young Israelite girl was aware of Naaman's struggle with leprosy and this disease that was killing him, and she was concerned for him. And so she said to Naaman's wife, if only Naaman would go to Israel, to Samaria, there's a prophet there, prophet of the true God, and if she went to him, he would have the power to heal my master Naaman. And there were many gods, false gods. There were many gods in Syria. And I'm sure Naaman had exhausted all of the efforts to be healed. And I'm sure he had gone to the prophets of these false gods in Syria, and that he had paid them and paid the gods and made sacrifices and done all that he could do to try and be healed through these false gods. But none of it had worked. He was still a leper, still struggling with this leprosy. And so when this young girl talks to Naaman's wife, and then Naaman's wife encourages Naaman to seek this out, he's willing because he's desperate. He wants to be healed. He knows that this disease will take his life. So Naaman goes to the king and says, I've heard about this prophet in Israel who may be able to heal me, and I want to go there. And I want to see if the Israelite God is able to heal me of this disease. So the king of Syria writes a letter and says, I'll take this letter with you, give it to the king of Israel. It'll have my seal on it. And so there will be authority there. And go and take some soldiers and take your chariots and your horses and go to Israel. And Israel and Syria had been enemies. They were at a time of peace during this time, but they had been enemies of one another and fighting one another on and off. And so you know that Naaman is pretty desperate to want to be healed, to go to Israel to be healed. But he wanted to do anything he could do to be healed. So the king wrote him a letter, and whether Naaman had the money or the king gave him the money, Naaman brought together his soldiers and his chariots and his horses, and he took his gold and silver and clothing and headed out to go to Israel to see the king and to see if the king could call his prophet to heal him. And I did some reading, and in today's dollars, the amount of gold and silver and the value of the clothes, a number of different commentaries said it would be the equivalent of about $1.2 million in today's dollars. So it was not a small offering that he was taking. He was taking a huge amount of money. And I'm sure most lepers wouldn't have that privilege of being able to just try and buy their healing. But this was Naaman's plan, was to try and go and buy this healing from the prophet in Israel. And so off they went, and they went to see the king. And the story says that when they went to the king, Naaman came to the king, and he had his whole entourage with him, and he gave the letter to the king, and he said, this is why I'm here. And the king of Israel reads this letter, and instead of saying, I think the king of Israel at that time had two options. His first option would be to say, yes, we do serve the one true God, and yes, our God is able to heal. And in fact, we have a prophet, Elijah, who is a man of God, who is really close to God, and God works through him and speaks through him. This is an opportunity. The king could have said, this is an opportunity for us to prove and show that our one true God is the only God. But that's not what happened. Instead of doing that, the king panicked and thought, we've been fighting back and forth, Syria and Israel, and now the king of Syria is trying to challenge me with something that I can't do. Who am I? I'm not a god. I can't just heal Naaman and take away his leprosy. And it points to the fact that even though Yahweh, the God of Israel, the one true God, was with the Israelites, they weren't all necessarily submitting and following him and obedient to him. And even the king, the leader of the country, didn't turn to God and look to God for help. Instead, he thought, well, if you're putting this on me, how can I do it? I'm not able to. And so it says the king tore his clothes and was really upset and thought, Syria is just trying to start another war and start another fight because there's no way that I can heal this guy. And so Naaman must have just been waiting to hear what was going to happen and if he was going to have this prophet come. And during this time, Elijah hears what's happening and hears that the king has just gotten all excited and upset and that the king thought this was a challenge on him. And Elijah says, no, send him to me so that everybody can know that there is a true God in Israel and that there is a prophet in Israel, someone that God is working through. Send him to me, I can heal him. And so the king goes back to Naaman and says, okay, I've calmed down, I've thought this through. I'm going to send you to the prophet Elijah, and he is a man of God, and we'll see what he can do. And so Naaman then heads off with his chariots and his horses and his entourage and his $1 million worth of gold and silver and clothes, and he travels to the home of Elijah. And Naaman comes. I mean, that would have been quite the entourage coming down the street. These big fancy chariots with the big rims on the wheels and the big fancy Egyptian horses strolling through town. People would have noticed. People would have seen that there's something special happening. And Naaman was used to being noticed, right? He's used to being elite and honored and respected. And so as he rolls up to the home of Elijah the prophet, he has all of these expectations. And he has all of these ways that he thinks things should go down and what will happen. And it says, that he thinks that Elijah will come out and there will be this great ceremony where he's showing respect to Elijah and wants to be healed. And Elijah will see that Naaman's a great man and that Elijah will want to do this for him. And it even says that he expects that, somehow Elijah will come out and wave his hand and do some great ceremonial ritual, and that Naaman will suddenly be healed right there. Well, that's not what happens in the story. This great general, this great commander, the second in command for Syria, comes to see Elijah, and Elijah doesn't even come to the door. Elijah doesn't even talk to him. Instead, he sends his servant, a messenger, out to talk to Naaman. And that would have been considered a great insult to a leader, to Naaman, that Elijah wouldn't come out, but that he would just send a servant or a messenger. But the messenger comes out to Naaman and says, well, this is what the prophet says. He says, what you should do is go down to the Jordan River and bathe yourselves, dip yourselves 7 times in the Jordan River, and you'll be healed of your leprosy. That's it. That's all there was to it. There was no ceremony. There was no getting together and having a big meal and recognizing each other and respecting each other. And it was just a servant saying, yeah, here's what you need to do. Go 30 miles down to the Jordan River, dip in there 7 times, trusting God that he can heal you, and he'll heal you of your leprosy. You would think that someone who is desperate to be healed of a disease that is going to kill them would just be excited to do whatever it might take and take any chance. But it says Naaman was angered and upset, and his pride was hurt because he thought it would be more of a ceremony, more of a pompous ritual where Elijah the great man would come out and meet Naaman the great man, and they would call on a great God and he would be healed. But that's not what happened. Instead, God decided to use a very simple command that had to be obeyed. And then it was up to Naaman to decide what he would do with that. And Naaman, who had tried all kinds of things, he had already tried in Syria to be healed. He had already paid money to the gods and made sacrifices and done all kinds of rituals to try and be healed in his own country. Now he's just being sent off and kind of just go do this and you'll be fine. And so he was frustrated and angry and ready to go back home. And he said, I thought that all of this would happen, but all he told me to do is this simple thing. And then he was angry. He said, and why would I go to the Jordan, another 30 miles to go to this dirty, muddy river in your country, when we all know that in Syria we have the 2 greatest rivers, and that I could have just done it there. He has these expectations, and Elijah doesn't meet his expectations. And he says 2 words that caught my attention, and 2 words that got him in trouble because of his pride, and 2 words that often get us in trouble because of our pride. In verse 11, Naaman says, well, I thought that it would go this way, and I thought that this is who your God would be, and I thought that this is what your God could do. And I mean, God has made us as human beings in his image, right? And he's given us incredible minds to be able to think, and he's given us opinions, and he's given us the ability to discern and to have knowledge and to have wisdom and all of this stuff. But we can also get tripped up in our pride and just kind of have our expectations of who we think God should be and how we think God should work and what we think God should do. And so Naaman says, well, I thought he would do this and this and this. And how often have I done that too? And maybe how often have you done that, where we think, this is what I think God is like, and this is what I expect God to do. And we kind of, instead of us stepping in and seeing who God is and aligning ourselves to him, we say, okay, God, this is my life and this is my kingdom, and this is how I see you fitting into my life and my kingdom. And I would love it if you could be the king here, and if you could do these things here. But I still have all these other areas that are mine because it's my kingdom. And it goes back to thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And I think God knew and used Elijah to humble Naaman and to say, Naaman, it's not about you. It's not about your $1.2 million that you think you can buy God's favor. It's not about your position and your fame and your wealth. I think God would say that whether you were the second in command and this great, incredible man in the country, or whether you're a poor servant leper, God would do the same thing, and God cares the same way. And that you can't earn or buy your salvation or your healing, but that it comes through faith in God. And so those two words, I thought, tripped him up. And his pride got in the way. And his own agenda, his own expectations got in the way of really seeing God and seeing who God was and seeing what God wanted to do in his life. And so he got angry and he started to walk away and leave. But thankfully, he had servants who could speak into his life and speak into his ear. And so some of his servants came up to him and said, Naaman, if the prophet had told you to do something very great and very complicated, wouldn't you have done it? If you had to do something elaborate, wouldn't you have done that? And yet he's asked you just to do something simple, just to go dip in the water and you can be healed. Maybe you should just go do that and trust that this God could heal you. And so Naaman is humbled, and he humbles himself, and he listens to the advice and the counsel of those who are serving him. And he calms down and he says, you're right. I've come all this way. We've traveled this distance. We've heard what the prophet has said. What will it hurt to at least go and try this? Maybe their God can heal me in this way. So they traveled to the Jordan River. As I studied, it looked like it was about 30 miles from where they were. So they traveled there, came to the water, and Naaman, this prestigious elite commander, second in command for a country, strips off his breastplate and his armor and all that stuff, and he goes down to the river and he walks in and exposes himself, probably showing his leprosy, and he walks into the water and he's supposed to dip himself 7 times. Now I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I imagine him going in and dipping himself under the water and coming up 7 times. So he goes into the water, into the Jordan, and he gets in and he goes down under the water the first time and he comes up. And there's no difference. He's still the same. He's like, well, it was 7 times. So he goes down again, a second time, as everybody's watching him and his entourage is watching him. People who are doing their wash at the river are watching him. People who are walking by. And he dips down a 3rd time and he comes up and he sees that there's no change. And he probably starts to think, am I just making a fool of myself? Is this prophet just making a fool of me that I'm here doing this? And at that point he could say, no, this is ridiculous, and walk away. But he kept going. And he had a certain amount of faith to believe that just maybe God could do this in his life. And so he went down a 5th time. And he went down a 6th time. And even after that 6th time dipping down under the water, he was still the same. Nothing had changed. And he went down a 7th time, and when he came up, he was healed. And God cleansed him and healed him of his leprosy. And it says that he had the skin of a child, of a small child, of a baby, that he was healed. And you can just imagine the excitement and the amazement of Naaman and of all the people watching to see this man dipping in the river, this man with leprosy, and to come up after the 7th time and to be healed and to see that God had done this. And of course, now everybody's super excited and amazed and in awe, and they right away say, we have to go back and tell this man of God, this prophet Elijah, that I'm healed, that this is amazing, that his God has healed me, and I now believe. And this guy Naaman, who didn't even believe necessarily in the God of Israel, who had tried going to the gods of Syria to be healed, and then decided maybe the God of Israel can do this. And perhaps he had this relationship where he knew this young servant girl, and she had shared about the God of Israel, and they would have known stories about the God of Israel because of their countries together. But for whatever reason, Naaman was both desperate enough and had enough faith to believe that maybe God, the God of Israel, would do this. And so they go back to Elijah. And this time, Elijah is willing to meet him. And I think that points to the fact that Naaman needed to be humbled, because now Elijah was happy to come out and meet with Naaman. And they met together, and Naaman said, "Thank you. This is incredible. I've been healed." And Naaman says, "I now know that the only true God is the God of Israel, Yahweh, that all other gods are false gods." And Naaman goes from unbelief to belief. And he sees God. He sees the true God through being healed and through having the faith that it could happen. And so he tries to pay Elijah, and he says, "Elijah, this is incredible. I'm healed. You've transformed, changed my life. Not only am I healed and I won't die of this disease, not only can I now still be in my position and do my job and be here for my family, but I also now believe in the true God, and I want to worship and follow." And he even calls Elijah, Naaman says, "I am your servant now," which would have been huge. Because for Naaman, he was only the servant to one person in the whole world, and that was the king of Syria. As second in command, he was only a servant to the king of Syria. But now he says, "Elijah, I'm now your servant because I'm God's servant, and I want to follow God now." And he says, "Let me pay you. I need to give you money." And that would have been the norm. That would have been the norm. All of these, there would have been prophets and religious leaders in Syria who were trying to tell the people there, this is what you need to do to appease the gods. This is what you need to do to make them happy. You need to pay this. You need to provide this. And so it would have been normal to say, I need to pay for the gods to do something for me. And so Naaman says to Elijah, take this. Take all of this money. Take all of this gold, all this silver, these fancy clothes as an offering, as a payment for what you've done for me. And Elijah says, no, that's not what it's about. It's not because you're rich and elite and wealthy that God cares about you, that he wants to show his power through healing you. God could have just as happily healed a poor servant leper who had nothing as he has healed you. And so Elijah says, I don't want your money. It's not about buying it. You can't buy your salvation. You can't buy favor with God. You can't, because of your position, have some special place with God. You're no different than anybody else. And so you don't need to give these luxurious gifts. And Elijah says, I don't want them. You keep them. So then Naaman tries, and Elijah says, no, that's it. That's what I've said. And so Naaman says, well, let me at least do this. Let me take some of the soil, some of the earth from here in Samaria and take it back to my hometown in Syria so that I can create a place to worship God and an altar to sacrifice things to God, the true God, Yahweh. And so Elijah allows him to do that and to take that. And so Naaman's grateful, and he heads back, and he is on his way home, having been healed, having had his eyes open to who the true God is. And as he's taking off, we see the second part of this story, where Elijah's servant, Gehazi, thinks that Elijah is crazy and says, that was $1.2 million. You know what we could do with that? You know how many people we could help? Do you know how many things we could buy? You know what I could personally buy with $1.2 million? And Gehazi is upset, and he can't believe that Elijah wouldn't take this money, wouldn't take these funds. Whether he thought they could advance ministry or whether he was just being completely selfish and wanted it just for himself. So what did Gehazi do? As Naaman was leaving, Gehazi went and chased after him and followed him, and he caught up to him and he said, so listen, Naaman, there's been a bit of a change here, and there's these sons of the prophets who have come back, and they have these needs, and we thought, well, you were offering money and we didn't need it, but now these guys need money. Just give us one talent, and I'll give it to these sons of the prophets, and they'll use it. Give us one talent and give us some clothes, 2 articles of clothing. And Naaman has no problem with it. He's like, I'll give you anything you want. I would give you everything. I'm so grateful and thankful. And so Naaman says, don't just take 1 talent of silver, 1 big bag of silver, take 2. And here's 2 of my servants that'll carry it for you. And here's 2 articles of clothing. I'm just so grateful, right? And so these 2 of Naaman's servants go with Gehazi and carry the silver back. And Gehazi makes sure that when they get back to near the prophet's house, that he quickly takes that money and hides it and sends those servants off, because he doesn't want Elijah to know that he has lied and that he has used Elijah's name to get this money that he shouldn't have, right? And again, here's a guy who has seen Elijah do incredible things, who has seen God do incredible things through Elijah. You would think that if there was anybody that had a clear picture of the awesomeness of God and who God was and wanted to just wholeheartedly follow God, you would think it would be this guy, because he was right there with Elijah all the time. And yet, he had this sinful root in his heart where he thought, here's a chance for me to grab some money, and it should be paid anyways. We should be rewarded for what's happened. And so he goes and he takes this money dishonestly and he hides it. And he's going to use it either for himself or for whatever. And then he goes to Elijah, and Elijah says, Gehazi, I see that you were gone for a bit. Where did you go? And Gehazi says, oh no, I didn't go anywhere. I've been here the whole time, master. But God spoke to Elijah and let Elijah know what was happening. And so Elijah said, I know exactly. God has shown me what you have done. And Elijah says to Gehazi, it's not about the money. It's not about religious ceremonies or religious instructions. It's about seeing God and obeying him and following him. And yet you've allowed your heart to be darkened by wanting to be greedy and just take this money. And so then Elijah does a very severe thing, and he says, the leprosy that's been taken away and taken off of Naaman, God is placing that on you. And not just you, but even generations to come in your family. And all of a sudden, Gehazi is cursed with this disease, with this leprosy. And not just him, but for generations to come. The story would be known that this servant of Elijah, the man of God, was greedy and was just not looking to do God's will, but to gain for himself. So I read through this chapter, I think of a couple different things. One of the things I think about is this young servant girl. This young servant girl who had been taken, whether her family had been killed or whether she had just been stolen away with other slaves, but she'd been taken to a different country, forced to serve a new master. And yet this young servant girl, in the midst of all of these people that didn't believe in her God, spoke up and talked about who her God was. And because of this young, insignificant servant girl, Naaman, the second most important man in Syria, finds God and wants to give his life to God and becomes a believer, a follower of God. And it makes me think we want to be quick to speak and to talk about who God is. And whether we're at school or we're at work or with our families, to speak up and to say, this is who God is. This is what he has done. This is what he can do. This is what he wants from you and for you. We want to be like that servant girl, to speak into people's lives and to point them to God. The other thing that really caught my attention is our expectations that we have of God. And sometimes we create our own little construct of who we think God is and how we think God works. And then we also have our expectations of wanting him to work in certain ways. So we say, okay, God, I believe you're this and this and this, but if all of a sudden I have these struggles or these difficult times or things don't go my way, then all of a sudden, are you different? And I think it's important for us to be able to humble ourselves to truly see who God is and to want to be a part of his kingdom, not just allow him to be a bit of a part of our kingdom. And so I was challenged this week as I read that about about how we can put God in a box and say, God, this is just who you are. And as I thought deeper about it, I thought, as someone who's been following the Lord for a long time, I can intellectually in my head understand and know who God is and be correct in my understanding of him. And yet in some of my sinful actions and my sinful desires, in those ways I can then say, okay, God, but now I'm just going to hold you down. I'm going to say, I want you to do things this way or this way. And if you don't, then I'm going to go my way and just be independent of you. And I think, like Naaman discovered, we have to be willing to humble ourselves and to see God and to follow him instead of just expecting him to act and behave the way that we would want him to. And then it's an interesting picture to see that someone who can be so close to God at work, the servant Gehazi, he's seeing Elijah do these incredible things on a regular basis and seeing God at work. And yet he was able to fall into sin. And we need to be able to guard ourselves and to really want to see God and not again just have our expectations of how we think God needs to serve us or take care of us. Instead, we need to see who God is, what he's doing, and enter into that with him. I find it interesting that in the Old Testament especially, we see so many stories about prophets. And I love that in this chapter and in this story, Elijah, the prophet, is referred to as the man of God. The man of God, the man who talked to God, the man who knew God, the man who was with God. And God's Spirit was on Elijah in a special way during this time. But we also know now that God's Spirit dwells within each of us as believers. And if you are a follower of Jesus and you've given your life to him, God's Spirit dwells within you. And so I'm not saying that we are all meant to be prophets in the same way that Elijah was, but we all have God's Spirit. And so as I read through this chapter this week, I thought, I want to be that way. Not for my own fame or prestige, but I want to be known as a man of God. The man of God, the man who talks to God, the man who prays with God, the man who hears from God and then acts on that. And again, for us as men and women, even as young boys and girls, we want to be that person who knows God and is talking to God and is with God so that he can use us to impact those around us. So yeah, that's 2 Kings chapter 5. And to me, I just walked away thinking, I want to make sure that my expectations of who God is and how he works, that it's not about me and just how I see him, but that it's about me understanding who he is and how he works. And I want more of him and less of me. And so I want to encourage you with that this week, and even to walk this week thinking, okay, God, what are the areas in my life where I've put you in this area and boxed you in and said, no, you need to just do it this way in order for me to believe? And what are the ways in your life that you are even holding God back or not following him or obeying him and allowing him to have authority in your life? Let's pray together.